You are listening to the Breaktime Tech Talks podcast, a bite-sized tech podcast for busy developers, where we'll briefly cover technical topics, news snippets, and more in short time blocks. I'm your host, Jennifer Reif, an avid developer and problem solver with special interest in data, learning, and all things technology. I think summer is supposed to be a quieter period for work and activities and events and such, but I haven't found that to be the case for me this year anyway. This week, I'll catch you up on what I've been working on the last few weeks. First, I gave a GraphRAG workshop last week where I needed to learn some Python and the Neo4j GraphRAG library. That was a little bit of an adventure, but I'll talk about my experience there and what I accomplished. Then I've had a busy few weeks making progress on lots of different content that I'll be using throughout the rest of the summer and fall for presentations, live trainings, and much more. I also have mentioned in previous episodes that I was struggling to do GraphRAG with Spring AI advisors. There's a few implementations out of the box that they provide using their advisors, and I wanted to be able to at least do the vector search component with that. And I'll catch you up on what I've learned and where I'm going with that. I was finally able to hash out some kind of solution there for using their Spring AI advisors for GraphRAG. I'll talk more about that. That is actually what I'm going to start with for today is the Spring AI advisors. Now, they have a couple of advisors that come out of the box in Spring AI for vector search and retrieval augmented generation. So it's their question answer advisor and their retrieval augmentation advisor. I've talked about this a bit in previous episodes, but it provides a customizable implementation of retrieval augmented generation in generative AI. I wanted to be able to use the default out-of-the-box implementations of these advisors and then tack on GraphRAG so that I wasn't doing a full GraphRAG pipeline manually. Previously, when I've done it manually, I've done the vector search and set those results to a variable, and then taken that, passed it into a graph retrieval query and returned those results into a variable, then stuffed the prompt with that variable and sent it over to the LLM to generate a response. The default question answer advisor I finally have working. I will leave a GitHub repository link. It's a separate branch of the Spring AI Goodreads repository that I have under my GitHub account. And then I also have a separate approach for using all completely custom advisors. So I use their default question answer advisor for one GitHub branch and then tacked on a graph retrieval advisor that's custom. But then I went completely custom and did both a vector retrieval advisor and a graph retrieval advisor completely custom as well. And I have a separate branch on my GitHub repository for that side of things. The whole implementation of the advisors plus the custom approach is a bit more complex and more code than what I had hoped, but everything does work and seem to operate very well. It adds a little bit more context going to the large language model as well, which is going to make your overall message length a bit longer. In a real case, I would probably trim out some of the unnecessary data that I was adding at each step in order to pass that context along. I've mentioned this in previous episodes, but I'll walk through it a little bit briefly here. Typically, you do a vector similarity search. You take those results and Spring formats them as a document generic entity type for the similar results that come back for the input query. And then you take those and you pass those similar results into a graph retrieval query to pull related connected entities for those similar results in your graph database, in our case. And then you retrieve those and you send that to the large language model and say, hey, what are the recommendations or what is the best answer based on the similar results and the graph data, the connected data that I've retrieved for this input. And I've done this all manually, as I've mentioned. With the advisors, you tack those on to your chat client call and it will run the vector similarity search, for instance, and add that as a parameter to your context for when it goes and sends the message to the large language model. That worked really well just doing a vector search, but then tacking on that graph, I had previously had trouble formatting and passing along those results from the vector search into the graph retrieval query. I've now figured out a way to do that. You just add a separate parameter to the context and then pass that into the next thing. And then you can read that back out. Now, I had mentioned that I was struggling to convert from the type of format that the context was coming in as, and then reading that and parsing it and getting the graph retrieval advisor to read that as well. I was able to do that, but as a forced conversion from one entity type to another, which is not really my favorite approach, but again, it's working, and I'll try to see if there's a cleaner, nicer way to do that. But that's where we are right now. And again, it is working. The other thing that I had been missing in previous iterations of this is from one advisor to the next. Because I have multiple advisors going, I need to call the advisor chain and call their .next call method on that in order to pass and go on to the next advisor. If you have multiple advisors and you're customizing that, you do need to use that call advisor chain .next call in order to go ahead and pass that on and move on to the next step. So that was a piece that I had been missing, so it wasn't moving on into that graph retrieval section because it wasn't getting that next call method triggered. So I've added that in. Now I'm able to pass from one to the next. I'm able to read from one thing to the next, and everything is working again. I will share the advisor code in the show notes so that you can check out the two different branches, one for using the default question answer advisor and a custom graph retrieval advisor, and then another approach for creating a vector search and graph retrieval separate advisors, completely all custom. That's one thing. Then the next thing, I had mentioned that last week I gave a workshop that was exploring the GraphRAG Python package. Now this is a Neo4j GraphRAG Python package, and it creates a composable pipeline of components for knowledge graph construction to use in GraphRAG. It has components for a data loader, a text splitter, a chunk embedder, a schema builder, lexical graph builder, entity and relation extractor, graph pruner, knowledge graph writer, and then an entity resolver. Again, there's a lot of pieces there. Everything is documented though in the documentation, and it's a bit complex to sift through. However, I found that the API documentation was really nice. There was good explanation of what needed to be passed into certain methods, what methods were available, and what things were being expected, and what was the output of that, and so on. I struggled a little bit with kind of the overall conceptual thing. I was pinging a colleague back and forth on some of that segment of things, but the API I was able to sift through and understand what needed to be done and what needed to be passed where. I did run into an issue with that package where I wanted to customize two components in the pipeline and then pass those two custom components to a full pipeline and just have it run the full pipeline. One piece of the pipeline requires a different input data format and doesn't seem to convert automatically, so I ended up needing to run each component separately rather than the whole pipeline. So just something to be aware of. Depending on which pieces and components of that pipeline you want to run, you might not be able to pass custom components into the full pipeline depending on your input-output data structures there. If you want to check out the GraphRAG Python package, I will send a link to that in the show notes, and you can check that out. It was a really nice package. I think there's a few things that continuously will be improved and updated as time goes on, but this was a nice start, and I was able to sift through it, especially as a non-Python developer. I was surprised and impressed that I was able to work on this. Then I have some updates on just general developer advocacy stuff that I'm working on. I mentioned that I gave the workshop last week. I worked really, really hard to help people be successful and understand how to work with Neo4j and generative AI and GraphRAG all together. Overall, the workshop went really well. The setup piece for just getting infrastructure up and running, for instance, a database and data loaded, is always the longest pole in the tent. We are making some progress on some updates, and I'm working hard. I'm going to give this again here in a few weeks at another event. So I'm trying to make some improvements there with some colleagues' help and see if we can reduce and make that infrastructure setup a bit more efficient. It was also really nice to connect with some colleagues that I either hadn't met at my company or I hadn't seen in a really long while. So that was lots of fun, but the week was super exhausting as well, and I needed a bit of recovery time. I also have a bunch of content that's upcoming. There's lots of conferences and events going on in August, so keep an eye on my social channels if you're interested in seeing what I'm working on and what I'm doing. I have some online training that I'm starting to put some things together for that. There's a tech book that possibly will be upcoming in the fall, and then finding good data sets for all of this content has always been a challenge, especially when you're looking at built-in connections for dealing with graph data plus AI capabilities on top of that. I'm hoping too that I can add in some tech blogs here and there as I go throughout the rest of this year. We'll see where life takes me. I also wanted to mention that I'm playing with some AI tools and I'm shifting my approach in the way that I'm doing learning. I've just noticed this over the course of the last few weeks. I spun up Claude Code and have been playing around with that and pulled down VS Codium and was able to install most of my extensions that I had been using in VS Code. So I'm exploring and playing around with this IDE and the functionality there. It has been a really nice combination using Claude Code in the terminal. This is where you'll have to have a subscription if you're looking at Claude or Claude Code, but you can pop up Claude inside one of your projects or your folders. And it's very good about asking, are you sure you want to give access to this folder or these files in this folder and so on. But it's really nice for getting second opinions or brainstorming ideas as I'm operating through content or development work or just social ideas and where I should go and what pathways I should follow and look at. It is also very interactive on what you allow it to apply and change within those files and directories. I found this to be really nice. Before it makes any changes, it says, hey, here are the changes in the diffs that we're looking at. Are you sure you want to apply these? Or no, hey, I want to tweak this and ask for something else. So it is very interactive, and I found this to be a really nice experience, especially if you like working in a terminal interactive chat structure. The content piece I want to look at this week is GraphRAG.com. Now, I knew this had existed earlier this year, but I haven't really had a chance to really dig in and look at all what is there, but I looked through a few things, and I've been providing this as a resource for a few different groups that I've talked to lately. And it is really comprehensive, really nice resource for what is GraphRAG. It's everything you need to know about GraphRAG. It talks about what it is and what knowledge graphs are, how you approach chunking, what are retrievers and what do the different types of retrievers look like, how you approach named entity recognition, so basically reducing duplicates and consolidating duplicate data, and then different types of graph shapes, things like hierarchical and memory structures, and how do you deal with all those different sorts of graphs and the formats and kind of the architecture that you put in there. I will link GraphRAG.com if you want to check that out. This is not just a Neo4j resource, it's something that the broader community is contributing towards and updating to help educate people on what GraphRAG is and how to do it more successfully. There are so many fast-paced updates going on in this space right now, and it's hard to stop and review the accomplishments. I explored outside my comfort zone with Python and the Neo4j GraphRAG Python package. Then I have a lot of upcoming projects that will likely have a longer timeline. I'll keep you posted on releases as they come. I finally had a breakthrough in implementing GraphRAG using Spring AI's advisors, and I mentioned how my learning is starting to shift over time. As always, thanks for listening and happy coding.